So tonight, we're here to kick off our Politics, Law, and Economics lecture series. The PLE lecture series is designed to highlight those institutions that must exist to support and defend a free civil society. Those institutions are good governance, the rule of law, and market-based institutions. Our speaker this evening is Mr. Hugh Whelchel. He is the Executive Director of the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. Prior to joining IFWE, and after having a successful career in the IT industry, he was named Executive Director of the Reformed Theological Seminary's Washington, D.C. campus, and he's also served as both the Executive Director and Board Member of the Fellows Initiative. Mr. Whelchel has a unique passion and expertise in helping individuals integrate their faith and their vocational calling. And he is the author of How Then Should We Work? Rediscovering the Biblical Doctrine of Work, which was published in May of 2012. He is also a contributor to the Washington Post on Faith Local Leaders website, and he is a graduate of the University of Florida and earned a master's degree in theology from Reformed Theological Seminary. He is an ordained ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church in America and serves in the leadership at McLean Presbyterian Church in McLean, Virginia, and he serves on the board of several Christian nonprofit organizations. Tonight, he's here to discuss Reweaving Shalom, the Christian's call to change the world. So if you would, please help me in providing a warm Florida Southern welcome to Mr. Hugh Whelchel.
Thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to be here at Florida Southern. My father grew up just up I-4 a little ways in a sleepy little town called Sanford, Florida. At 17 years old, he lied about his age and joined the Army. He'd never seen snow a day in his life, as you can imagine growing up in Central Florida, until he saw it looking out of a boxcar going across the north of France to the front line, where he fought in something called the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was the worst really engagement of the entire World War II theater. He did well, he lived. He finished up his tour of duty, came back to the United States. He earned a Purple Heart as well as a Bronze Star for valor. Came back and decided to go to college on the GI Bill. And guess where he went? Florida Southern. He studied agriculture, was very interested in citrus, so he got a degree in agriculture with an emphasis on citrus. And many years he told me about the incredible time he had when he was here. He really thought very highly of the school. So it's a great honor for me to come back and be able to speak at his alma mater. He passed away only last year, and we had the opportunity to bury him at Arlington Memorial Seminary in Washington, D.C. with full military honors. It was quite an exciting time to be there. My father told me one time, right before he passed away, he said, "Hugh, I think I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. I think I have fulfilled my purpose, the reason God's put me on this planet." It's interesting, I didn't think about it at the time because I always thought I'd have more time to talk to him later on. But I wish I'd asked him, what were those things? Because those are the type of things we talk to people about at the Institute of Faith, Work, and Economics. We started the organization several years ago specifically to help particularly evangelical Christians, which is our target audience, think through what is it that they're supposed to do. What is the impact that they are to have throughout their lives on their families, their churches, their communities, and the places that they work every day. Now, interestingly enough, there's a real disconnect in Christian circles today around these areas. And really, since that's our emphasis, what I'm going to talk to you about today really comes out of this kind of Christian tradition of understanding the intersection of work, faith, and economics. Something that most people in the evangelical church today have completely forgotten. And it really stems from an idea that Christians in the 20th century and into the 21st century have let this idea of the sacred secular divide seep into everything that they do. So they go to work on Monday thinking, my work is very secular. They go to church on Sunday or Bible study or in the middle of the week and think that's spiritual. But what I do every day is secular. And there's been this spiritual secular divide. Now I would argue with you that that has not been in historical Christianity. In fact, for almost 1900 years, just the opposite was taught. And this is something new that's crept in to kind of the theology of the church, which I think is wrong. It's one of the things we talk a lot about. And if you look at the Bible, the specific teaching of the Bible, I think you can see this very clearly. For example, Paul tells the Christians in the Colossian church, he tells them the following.
Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving.
And Paul tells the early church, do everything to glorify God. He's talking about everything. Everything you do. Whether you're working, whether you're going to school, whether you're serving in the community, everything. He's not just talking about what people do in church. Yet that has been lost on the Christian community. How many times, if you've been around a church, if you grew up in a church, I've heard this many times. Did you hear about John quitting his job to go into full-time Christian service? The church for 1900 years taught all work is full-time Christian service. That everything that you do is really aimed at serving your fellow man and bringing about flourishing within the community, within the area of influence that God has given you. This was the mainstay of Christian teaching throughout most of the Western civilization, the history of Western civilization. In fact, I would argue with you that almost everything good that's been done in Western civilization, whether it was the abolishment of slavery, whether it was women's rights, whether it was starting hospitals, universities, great art, great music, great science, was done by Christians, for the most part, who understood that it was their calling from God to do things that would bring about flourishing, what the Bible calls shalom, in their communities. This is how they rewove shalom. But we've gotten away from that. And so what we're trying to do at the Institute is really talk about these issues and how they relate to some other larger issues that I want to talk about tonight, specifically the issue of economic freedom. We were asked about a year and a half ago if we would participate and help write an amicus brief to be read by the Supreme Court in the recent Hobby Lobby case. And the emphasis of the thing that we wrote was really wrapped around this idea of religious freedom. Let me read you just one quick line out of the amicus brief that we submitted before the Supreme Court. I have to be honest with you, I have some lawyer friends, and I had to send them a note and say, look, my amicus brief got read by the Supreme Court. They hated it, absolutely hated it. But, you know, not that I was proud of it or anything, but, so let me read you one passage from it. The full picture of religious freedom reveals a deep liberty that goes much farther than the right to believe as one chooses, and that extends well beyond the right to private devotion in one's own personal place of worship. Religious freedom incorporates the right to act according to one's moral beliefs and convictions, and more than freedom to worship privately, it is the right to live one's faith freely and in the public sphere. Now, you need to understand, this is not something that Christians have just made up in the last 5 or 6 years. This idea was one of the bedrock ideas, one of the very foundations that America was built on. Many, many people came here, greatly influenced, specifically seeking religious liberty, religious freedom. Whether it's the Pilgrims, or the Puritans, or the Huguenots, And interesting enough, I was watching the news last night. There are people right now who are refugees trying to find places to live in Europe. And many of them are fleeing places in the Middle East. Why? Because they're seeking religious liberty. They may not couch it that way, but that's what many of them are looking for. Because many of them fear, particularly Christians, if they stay in some of these many countries, they will not live to see tomorrow, nor will their children live to see tomorrow. And I think they have a good reason to believe that. It's an interesting story that most of us don't know because it's been written out of history books. Two important characters in the American founding, James Madison and George Mason, were discussing the Virginia state constitution. George Madison was writing it, and he used the term, and wanted to use this term, religious tolerance, because in that day, in 1776, when they were writing this, religious tolerance was the highest level that anybody thought about. Religious tolerance is what's talked about in the Magna Carta and a lot of the documents in Europe. But a younger James Madison said, no, it's not religious tolerance we should be talking about. It's religious liberty. Because you see, religious tolerance is given to us by the state. And what the state gives us, the state can take away. He said, our religious liberty is an inalienable right given to us by God. It's a right that no one has the right to take from us. Mason said, you make a good point. And he changed the wording to include in the next draft this idea of religious liberty. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is the first time the idea of religious liberty is ever put into any document in the history of the world. Many historians say the one important thing that the American experiment brings to the idea of liberty is this idea of the importance of religious freedom, religious liberty. It is truly something unique. And interestingly, as soon as it was put in the Virginia state constitution, all the other states adopted it and put it into their constitutions. And then 12 years later, when Madison is writing our Constitution, where does he put it? He puts it in the Bill of Rights, the first article. Now, here's the interesting thing. Fast forward 200 plus years. Today, there are those in the government who would say, this religious liberty thing, we need to control it. In fact, we'd be better off if we had religious tolerance than religious liberty. Why? Because the government cannot control religious liberty. They can control religious tolerance. It's all about control. Let me show you an example. This is a case that was argued in a lower court just before the Hobby Lobby case was argued in the Supreme Court. And the Justice Department tips its hand in the argument. You can really see where they're coming from. Here's what they say. They say basically, first, seeking profit. In other words, if you enter into a business, seek profit. Seeking profit is a wholly secular pursuit. Once we go into business, we lose our religious freedoms in the context of those activities. All who engage in such secular undertakings must accede to the precepts of secular ideology. And finally, they conclude the government then is the one who establishes these precepts through the passage of laws and regulations. Now I ask you, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with this picture? And I would suggest, particularly from a Christian, this was our argument, and this is one of the things we're trying to take out to these 80 million evangelical Christians in the United States today and get them to wake up to see what's happening under their very noses, right? Is that this whole argument is based on a false presupposition. Their presupposition is that seeking profit is a wholly secular pursuit. Says who? Certainly Christians should not believe that. Now a lot of them have been sucked into this, once again because of this spiritual secular divide that we've worked up in our own minds. But if you look at what Christianity has taught for 1900 years, This is simply not the truth. It's not what our founding fathers believed. See, they believed that religious liberty was the most important. That's why it's the First Amendment. They believed all the liberties flowed from this one liberty. And I'll talk about it more in a second. So let me show you something then. It kind of sums up what I've been talking about.
Our lives are not divided into two halves, with one part being sacred and another part secular. Worship is not reserved only for Sunday morning, but for Monday morning as well. Every time we get out of bed and ready ourselves for the day. Every time we labor at a task, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Every moment is a gift. Every moment belongs to the one who gave us that moment. There is a way that leads a man to flourish. It is freedom. The freedom to discover his true potential, to keep the fruits of his labor, to find fulfillment in his work. These freedoms are the right of every person, because they come woven into the God-given dignity of every person. Where they exist, societies and people flourish. Where they are absent, there is only poverty. These freedoms must be championed, for this is God's design for us, for the good of all He has created.
Dorothy Sayers, who was a friend and fellow author with C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, wrote an essay called Why Work almost 80 years ago. Let me tell you, read you a little bit of what she said. In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the secular vocation. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments and is astonished to find that, as a result, the secular work of the world is turned purely selfish and destructive ends, and that the greater part of the world's intelligent workers have become irreligious, or at least uninterested in religion. But is that astonishing? How could anyone remain interested in a religion that seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life? Another author named Os Guinness wrote a book about 20 years ago called The Calling. And in this book, he talks about God's calling on a Christian's life. Once again, I'm talking strictly out of my tradition, but I think it's important to understand where this comes from. Guinness writes this: the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, everything we have is invested with a special devotion, dynamism, and direction, lived out in a response to his summons and service. Guinness goes on to say that our primary calling as Christians, and this is once again the tradition that goes back all more 1,000 years, is to become disciples of Christ. But that discipleship is something that we become. And it leads to what Dennis calls 4 secondary callings, which are the things that we do. This is how we work out our faith in the real world. And these secondary callings are called to the church, the work that we do in our churches. Our call to our family, the work we do in our families. Our call to the community, the work we do in our communities to bring about flourishing. And finally, the work that we do through our vocation, where interestingly enough is where most of us spend most of the time that we are going to walk on this earth, is doing what you guys are preparing to do right now while you're in school. Of course, I would argue that your vocation now is one of a student. And you have just as much responsibility, if you are a Christian, to work at that wholeheartedly as you will when you graduate and take a position. It's interesting, a friend of mine named Richard Pratt, Dr. Richard Pratt, who has a PhD from Harvard, a really brilliant guy, and you can tell by the way he talks, and we'll read a quote to you here in a second. He said this. He said that we think Jesus came to forgive our sins, make our souls sparkle, to sprinkle us with peace and joy, so we can sprout wings when we die, grab a harp, and join an eternal choir. Now, he got a PhD at Harvard for saying things like that. But I think he's right. There's this misconception that Christianity is a bus ticket to heaven. Nothing is farther from the truth. Christians need to be engaged in doing good things like Christians have done down through the centuries that make a difference, that reweave shalom. And shalom is just a biblical word for flourishing, that brings about flourishing within the places in which they work. Now, let me tie in a couple of loose pieces I want to talk to you about. One is about poverty. Recently, there was a report put out by the World Bank, not a hotbed for conservative ideas by any stretch of the imagination. The report said simply this, that in the last 25 years, more people have been raised out of abject poverty. And abject poverty is poverty, people are living less than $1.50 a day. That's the UN's definition. More people have been raised out of abject poverty in the last 25 years than the entire rest of the history of the world combined. It's a staggering idea. Then the report goes on to say something else that's even more amazing. In the next 25 years, if we continue on the trajectory we're on right now, we will wipe out poverty from the face of the earth. Have you read that? Have you seen that on CNN? It's not in the Wall Street Journal. I read that. It's not in the New York Times. I guess I don't read the New York Times, so I'm speculating. Why? Why is that not being talked about? I'll tell you why. Because the reason behind it that they go on to articulate in the report doesn't fit into anyone's preconceived notion of how you wipe out poverty. You see, poverty is being wiped out from the face of the earth not by government programs. In fact, there are a lot of people who argue government programs are doing more harm than they are good. It's not being wiped out by Christian charity. It's being wiped out by the rise of something called economic freedom. Let me show you what economic freedom is.
Imagine you had to live in a country from one of these two lists for the rest of your life. Which list would you choose? If you're like most people, you would choose A. Let's take a look at why that is. Take Chile and Venezuela. Chile's poverty rate is half that of Venezuela's, and its inflation rate is a fraction of the size. Actually, all of list A appears to be better off than B. Look at income per person. It's 10 times higher on average in list A. But these lists aren't organized by income. They're organized by economic freedom. List A countries have the most free economies in the world. List B, the least free. Across the globe, we see a strong relationship between economic freedom and people's quality of life. For instance, people in the most free countries earn, on average, over 8 times more than people in the least free. The poor earn 10 times more. People in the most free countries are happier. They have better protected civil rights, cleaner environments, and the average person lives 20 years longer. The freest countries also have less corruption, less infant mortality, less child labor, and less unemployment. So if you care about improving people's lives, then you really care about economic freedom. And having economic freedom means your property is protected under an impartial rule of law. You're free to trade with others for what you need and want. Your money keeps its value because your national currency is stable. And government stays small relative to the size of the economy. For years, the U.S. was among the world leaders in economic freedom. But over the last decade, the U.S.'s ranking fell, and it's projected to keep falling. The question is, will our quality of life fall with it?
That's a good question. Now, a lot of people say that it will. See, we in the United States, we're not learning this. And I would argue further, this is one of the things we argue at the Institute of Faith, Work, and Economics, that there's a connection between economic freedom and religious freedom. In fact, I would go as far to say is that religious freedom is necessary for economic freedom. And if I had the time tonight, I could lay out a case for that. And we do on our website and some of the other things that we've published. We would invite you to take a look at those. But it's the same argument that our founding fathers made. This is why they made the first freedom. Over 200 years ago, they got this. They understood how this worked. And unfortunately, we've lost it. And we're not learning it in a lot of schools and universities today. That's why I'm so excited to be here. And I'm excited that you guys are taking the time to look at these things. Because these are the kind of things that change the world. And you guys are the future leaders of the world. You're the guys and gals that are going to have to pick up the mess that my generation made and set things right. And if you don't understand this, I don't think that you have much of a chance. See, James Madison said that he said that religious freedom is the first freedom because he saw it, and he saw that in fact it was a precondition for all the other freedoms. That's why it's the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. That all the other freedoms flow out of this amendment. The freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, all these things flow from religious freedom. Madison wrote that each of us has rights that flow from our duty we owe God. He said this, before any man can be considered a member of civil society, he must first be considered as the subject of the governor of the universe. Now, I would argue that the American experiment proves what I'm saying, the connection between economic freedom and religious freedom. But let me show you some other evidence. There's a fascinating article several years ago, Christianity Today, about a guy named Robert Woodley is his name, sociologist. He set out to do his dissertation, and what he wanted to do is answer one of the most difficult questions that still is out there. And the question he wanted to answer is, why do some countries struggle with dictatorships, with poverty, with all the things that we see in the newspaper today, while other countries that are right next door, same environment, same resources, flourish and have much, much more, not only religious freedom, but economic freedom and political freedom. What is the difference? So in his dissertation, he set out, as a good sociologist, to look at all the variables and see which one had the highest correlation. And he did this incredibly detailed search with over 100 different variables. And most of them he saw no difference at all. But as his research continued, one emerged. And he was hesitant at first to even mention it. The more and more he worked on this, the more mathematical models he ran, the more and more it became very obvious to him that the countries that did better, almost without exception, were countries where Protestant missionaries had a major influence in the 19th century. And so that was the conclusion of his dissertation. Guess what? No one would publish it for him. Because see, the narrative that's out there is that missionaries have raped all these countries and done all these terrible things for years and have done more damage than they have good. I want to say that's the narrative, but there's no facts to support that. Interesting enough, Whitley's given a large grant, multi-million-dollar grant, and went and got 50 researchers and went back and did everything in just a huge way. Did lots more research. And guess what? After all the research was said and done, the correlation was even higher than the original research he'd done. He went to one of the top academic journals in sociology in the world, submitted it to them, and they said, we don't believe your results, but we cannot refute it, so they published it. And I would argue, as does, interesting enough, the person that writes this article. Let me read you what she says, because it's very, very telling. So at the end of the article, she says, do you want a blossoming democracy today? The solution is simple, if you have a time machine. Send a 19th century missionary. Because where these missionaries were, for a long time, these countries had more economic freedom, they have stronger democracy, they have people who have more entrepreneurial natures. They have less poverty. All those things, all those economic variables that you saw in that one film, they have all those. And I would argue that this goes back to this tie between religious liberty and economic freedom. Once again, let's look at a quote from Dorothy Sayers.
Christians must revive a centuries-old view of humankind as made in the image of God, the eternal craftsman, and of work as a source of fulfillment and blessing.
You see, unfortunately, the Justice Department, the United States Justice Department, is trying to redefine the First Amendment in such a way that it restricts Christians and others' right to fulfill their biblical and vocational calling in any job outside the church. This has huge implications because for every Christian, work is a religious activity. And for others, and other religions as well. It's just not Christians. So we have to be careful not to let this idea of religious liberty escape us and be turned into religious tolerance that can be controlled by the government in a power grab to try to drive things in this country in the direction that they want to go. I think it spells disaster if we let that happen. But like I said, once again, unfortunately, there are a lot of people, a lot of the Christians I took to never heard of this. They've never heard about Madison or Mason or religious tolerance, religious liberty. And as a result, they have had their heads buried in the sand. And things are going around them that will shape and change this country for the next 100 years. And I don't think for the better. Of course, that's just my opinion. But I think that I have some pretty impressive people historically on my side as well. So I want to close with one last quote from the Bible. And I think it's one that kind of sums up our message that we're trying to talk to evangelicals as we wrap together these ideas of faith, work, and economics. The Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians, he writes this, "For you are called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." If all of us are going to make a difference, we have to work in a way that serves the common good, that brings about flourishing, that radically changes our communities and the direction our communities are going, the direction our country's going, and I believe if we do it, we can change the way the world's going. But we have to understand what drives things. We have to understand the theology, if you will, the political underpinnings of what made our country so incredibly successful in the past and not turn our back on those things. And not let our government walk away from what made this nation great. Thank you.